Okay, boys and girls, sorry for the delay in getting another book posted. I've been trying to figure out technology and the best and easiest way to film these books. I still have yet to come up with it, but we're going to go ahead today with Ian Fleming's story of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, The Magical Car, adapted for beginning readers by Al Perkins, illustrated by B. Tobey. This has also been made into a movie, but I grew up with this book when I was young. Jeremy Potts and his sister Jemima were in the kitchen. Mrs. Potts was making sandwiches. They heard a noise outside, and they ran out to see what it was. The noise came from a great big car. Mr. Pot was sitting in it. "I found it in the junkyard," said Mr. Pot. "Jump in, I'll take you for a ride." They're in England, hence the accent or try of an accent. There were all kinds of lights and buttons in the car. Mr. Pot pushed the starter. The engine made a noise. It sounded like chitty chitty bang bang. "That's what we'll name our car," said Jeremy. "We'll call her Chitty Chitty Bang Bang." Mr. Pot drove out onto the highway, and soon Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was going 100 miles an hour. "Where are we going?" asked Mrs. Pot. "To the beach," said Mr. Pot. "We'll have a picnic." You'll notice that the steering wheels, aren't on the same side as our cars. That's how it is in England and some other European countries. But everyone else was going to the beach, too. Mr. Pot had to stop. "This is not a good place for a picnic," said Mr. Pot. "We'll just have to sit and wait," said Mrs. Pot. Then a button lighted up. There were words on the button. "Push me." "Push it and see what happens," said Jeremy. Mr. Pot pushed the button. The engine made a humming noise. The car began to shake. Then wings came out, just like wings on an airplane. "It's magic!" Jemima shouted. "I guess it is magic," said Mr. Pot. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang flew up off of the highway. She flew over all the cars in front of her. She flew up into the sky like a bird. She headed for the beach. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang flew over the beach. It was full of people. "Where will we ever have our picnic?" asked Mrs. Potts. "There's no place to land." Just then the steering wheel turned in Mr. Potts's hand. The car began to steer herself. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang flew away from the beach. She flew out over the water. She left the land far behind. Then she pointed her nose down. She drove straight toward the waves. "We're going to crash," said Mrs. Pot. We'll have a wet picnic." But Chitty Chitty Bang Bang didn't crash. She pulled in her wings and she landed on the water. She headed for the beach. "This must be France," said Jeremy. "See the French flag on the lighthouse?" France and England aren't very far away. If we had our globe, I'd show you. "There's no one here," said Mrs. Pot. "It's a fine place for a picnic." She took out the picnic things. She spread a tablecloth on the sand. "Here's a big cave we can explore," said Jeremy. He and Jemima ran into the cave. It looked dark and spooky inside. "Look!" yelled Jemima. There, just ahead, was a skeleton. It swung back and forth. Its bones rattled in the cold wind, and Jemima screamed. Mr. and Mrs. Pot heard the scream. They drove Chitty Chitty Bang Bang into the cave. "That's not a real skeleton," said Mr. Pot. "It's only a dummy. Someone put it here to scare us. Someone doesn't want us in the cave, but we'll go in anyway. I see a printing error in this book. You'll see the quotation marks right there. That means Mr. Pot is supposed to be done reading or speaking, but they didn't put new ones to start. And here we see it close the quotation again. Did you catch that? They drove deeper and deeper into the dark, gloomy cave. Bats flew around their heads. Water dripped from the rocks. Spiders and snakes came out. "What's that up ahead?" asked Jeremy. It was a big room. It was full of guns. There were boxes of bombs and barrels of gunpowder. "That is strange," said Mr. Pot. That can't be a good sign, can it? They saw a sign, and it was nailed to the wall. They walked over and read it. "Danger! These guns belong to Joe the Monster. Hands off!" "I know all about Joe the Monster," said Jeremy. "I read about him in the paper. He's a bank robber." "This must be his secret cave," said Jemima. "Let's blow up all this stuff," said Jeremy. "That's a fine idea," said Mrs. Pot. "Then we can have our picnic." Mr. Pot put one end of a fuse into a barrel of gunpowder. He lighted the other end, then said, "Let's get out of here fast." Do you think that that's a very good idea? I don't know that that's a very good idea. Boys and girls, do not do this at home. They got out just in time. Boom, boom! The whole cave blew up. Just then, a big black car drove up. 3 men jumped out and pointed guns at the Pot family. "Hands up!" shouted one of the men. "That's Joe the Monster," said Jeremy. "I've seen his picture in the paper." "Tie up the 2 big ones," said Joe the Monster. His men tied up Mr. and Mrs. Pot. They tied them up tight. Joe pushed Jemima and Jeremy into the big black car. "We'll take these kids to Paris," he said. "We'll hold them for ransom." Mr. and Mrs. Pot sat up. They couldn't untie their hands. They watched the big black car drive away. Jeremy and Jemima looked out of the big black car. Jemima began to cry. "We'll never see Mother and Father again," she cried. Then Chitty Chitty Bang Bang coughed. She shook all over. Then she made a humming noise. Then she picked up Mrs. Pot. She put her in the seat. Then she picked up Mr. Pot. Then Chitty Chitty Bang Bang took the road to Paris. Mr. and Mrs. Pot still had their hands tied. But Chitty Chitty Bang Bang steered herself. She raced along at 100 miles an hour. She raced after Joe the Monster in the big black car. They got closer and closer to Paris. They got closer and closer to the big black car. The 2 cars raced through Paris. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang came right up behind the big black car. She bit the big black car. I've never heard of a car biting another car, but that sure looks good. Bonbons. Joe the Monster and his men jumped out. They ran upstairs into a house. Jeremy and Jemima ran over to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Jeremy untied Mr. Pot. Jemima untied Mrs. Pot. Joe the Monster began shooting, but Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was not afraid of bullets. She roared up the stairs. Mr. Pot and Jeremy ran up behind her. "I'm going to call the police," said Mrs. Pot. That is a very good idea. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang went through the door. She raced across the room. She pushed Joe the Monster and his men against the wall. She pushed them so hard they dropped their guns. She held them until the police got there. Yay for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. The police put handcuffs on Joe and his men. They tied them all together. They took them away to jail. Then the chief of police thanked the Pot family. "You caught Joe for us," he said. "Now, what can we do for you?" "Please find us a place to have our picnic," said Mrs. Pot. "I'm getting very hungry." The chief of police took them to a beautiful park. They all sat down to eat. "I hope you like peanut butter," said Mrs. Pot to the chief of police. Chitty Chitty Bang Bang ate too. The French police fed her gasoline. They fed her water. They washed her and polished her until she looked new. That night, the Pot family and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang started back home. "It will be nice to get home again," said Jemima. "It sure will," said Jeremy. "But who knows what will happen before we get there?" The end of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I love this book and the movie. The movie is quite different, though, and I hope you enjoyed it too.